The shovel was an extension of his arms, the steel blade a hardened fingernail scraping against the unyielding clay of the hillside. Each plunge sent a dull shock up through the ash handle, a vibration that hummed in the bones of his forearms and settled deep in his shoulders. Elias Cole, all of 19 years and carrying the weight of a much older man, did not mind the ache. It was a feeling of substance, of physical truth in a world that had recently become ethereal and thin. His parents were gone, taken by the fever that spring, leaving him with 40 acres of unforgiving land, a mortgaged farmhouse he couldn't afford to heat, and a dog whose steady brown eyes held the only real certainty left. The dog, a rangy shepherd mix named Barrow, lay at the top of the excavation, his chin resting on his paws. He watched Elias's methodical rhythm, the blade biting into the earth, the grunt as Elias leveraged a scoop of dense soil, the swing and release that sent the dirt arcing onto a growing mound. For 3 weeks, this had been their world. The sun would rise over the eastern ridge, casting long shadows that retreated as Elias worked, and set behind the hill he was carving into, plunging them into a cool, early twilight. Barrow never strayed. He was a silent witness, a furry anchor in the slow-moving tide of his master's grief and determination. Today, the rhythm was broken by the sound of a horse. Elias paused, shovel planted in the ground, and wiped a sleeve across his brow, smearing dirt and sweat. Mr. Abernathy sat atop his gray mare on the path below, his face a road map of weathered skepticism. He was a man who had farmed this valley for 50 years, a man whose hands were as cracked and hard as the land itself. He believed in what he could see, and what he saw made no sense. "What in God's name are you doing, boy?" Abernathy's voice was a gravelly rumble that carried easily in the still autumn air. Elias looked at the hole, a raw, rectangular wound in the green slope, now 12 feet deep and nearly 50 feet long. He looked at the pile of dirt, a miniature mountain of his own making. "Building a home," he said. His voice was quiet, unused to conversation. Abernathy spat a stream of tobacco juice, a dark stain on the dry grass. "You've got a home, your father's home, a perfectly good house standing right over there." He gestured with his chin toward the clappered farmhouse, its paint peeling like a sunburnt back. It looked lonely, vulnerable. "Can't heat it," Elias said, his gaze returning to his work. The words were a simple fact, stated without self-pity. The mortgage payment took nearly everything. The cost of cordwood and coal to fight a valley winter in that drafty old house was a mountain he could not climb. "So you're digging a grave instead?" Abernathy's laugh was a dry, rasping sound. "That's the craziest thing I've ever seen. What are you planning to do? Live in a root cellar like a hibernating bear?" Elias didn't answer. He bent down and picked up a leather-bound book from beside his water canteen. It was his grandfather's journal, the spine cracked and the pages filled with a spidery, precise script, interspersed with detailed drawings of gears, water wheels, and strange-looking buildings. He opened it to a marked page. A diagram showed a semi-cylindrical structure, its curved back nestled deep into the earth. Arrows depicted the flow of winter wind over the top, the path of the low winter sun striking a glass-faced front, and the circulation of heat from a central masonry stove. "I have a plan," Elias said, more to himself than to the old farmer. Abernathy shook his head, the pity in his eyes sharper than any scorn. "A plan in a book won't keep the frost from your bones, son. That hill will be a block of ice come January. It'll sweat in the summer and leach the life right out of you in the winter. You listen to me. Sell off a few acres to Thorne. Fix the farmhouse. That's a real plan. He nudged his mare with his heels. Don't say I didn't warn you. Elias watched him ride away. Barrow lifted his head, a low whine in his throat. Elias reached out and scratched the dog behind the ears, his calloused fingers finding the familiar soft spot. He looked back at the journal. His grandfather had been an engineer, a man the valley considered brilliant but eccentric. He wrote of the Earth's thermal mass, of its ability to store and release heat, to act as a massive, stable blanket. The ground at a depth of 10 feet, the entry read, remains a near constant 55 degrees, regardless of the air temperature above. This is not a weakness, it is the greatest of strengths. We fight the cold when we should be embracing the warmth of the earth itself. He closed the book. Mr. Abernathy was a good man, but he saw the earth as a surface to be plowed. Grandfather had seen it as a partner. Elias picked up his shovel. He had a foundation to pour before the first hard frost. The sun was getting low. The work remained. He drove the blade back into the soil, the rhythmic shock humming through his arms once more, a familiar and grounding communion. This was his home. The weeks that followed blurred into a litany of labor. Elias poured the concrete for the foundation, a long, thick slab reinforced with scavenged steel rods he'd bought for $17 at the scrapyard. He worked with a rented mixer, hauling sand and gravel from the creek bed in a wheelbarrow whose single wheel carved a deep, unwavering rut in the path from the water's edge to the construction site. Mrs. Gable, whose property bordered his to the south, would sometimes watch him from her porch, her hands worrying her apron. She saw a boy punishing himself, a grief-stricken child digging a hole to bury himself in. She saw the raw blisters on his hands when he came to her well for water, the exhaustion etched around his eyes. "Elias, child," she'd said one afternoon, pressing a jar of cool buttermilk into his hand. "This isn't right. There's no shame in asking for help. The church has a fund." "I'm fine, Mrs. Gable," he'd replied, his voice gentle but firm. "Thank you for the milk." He didn't try to explain the diagrams in the journal, the physics of thermal inertia. It would sound like madness. He had learned early that explanations were just words, and words were wind. The structure itself would be the only explanation that mattered. After the foundation cured, the steel arrived. A flatbed truck, groaning under the weight, delivered a pallet of curved, corrugated steel ribs and hundreds of panels, the components of a military surplus Quonset hut he'd ordered with the last of his parents' savings. The driver, a man with a city face, looked at the hole in the hill and then at Elias. "You sure this is the right place, kid?" "It is," Elias said, signing the delivery slip. For the next month, the valley echoed with a new sound. The percussive clang of steel on steel, the whine of a wrench tightening bolts. Raising the first arch was the hardest part. He built a rudimentary gin pole, a system of ropes and pulleys anchored to a large oak tree. He strained, muscles screaming, his feet slipping in the mud, until the first massive rib was upright, a perfect steel rainbow against the sky. Barrow barked, a rare explosion of sound, as it settled into its anchors in the concrete. Elias leaned against it, panting, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was real. The skeleton was taking shape. One by one, the arches went up, each bolted to the last, forming a long, ribbed tunnel. He was a boy building a metal whale, a creature whose belly would be his sanctuary. Mr. Thorne, the valley's wealthiest landowner, drove by in his new Ford pickup, slowing to a crawl. He owned the bank that held Elias's mortgage. He saw the steel structure not as a home, but as an eyesore, a piece of industrial junk defiling the pastoral landscape. He saw a boy squandering his inheritance on a fool's errand, making it all the more likely the bank would soon own this land. He shook his head and drove on, already composing the letter he would send about delinquent payments. It was during the sheathing of the structure that Sarah first approached him. She was the town librarian's daughter, a girl with quiet eyes and a way of moving that seemed to make no sound. He had seen her in town, but they had never spoken. She didn't come with pity or questions. She walked up the path carrying a small basket. "I saw you were working through lunch," she said, her voice as soft as her footsteps. "I brought you a sandwich." "And one for your friend." She nodded toward Barrow, who thumped his tail against the dirt. Elias, perched on a ladder 20 feet up, nearly dropped his wrench. He climbed down, his face smudged with grease and dirt. He felt awkward, clumsy in her presence. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said, a small smile touching her lips. She looked at the half-finished structure, her head tilted. Unlike the others, her expression wasn't one of confusion or derision. It was curiosity. "It's like the shell of a tortoise." Elias blinked. He'd never thought of it that way, but it was perfect. Strong, unassuming, protected by its own shape. "My grandfather's design," he said, the words coming out more easily than he expected. She stayed while he ate, asking simple questions. Not "why are you doing this?" but "how does that piece fit there?" and "what will you do for light?" He found himself showing her the journal, pointing to the plans for the south-facing wall, which would be almost entirely glass. He described the ventilation shafts he would build, one low on the west wall for intake, another high on the east wall, creating a natural convection current. She listened, her brow furrowed in concentration, tracing the drawings with her finger. "It makes sense," she said finally. "It's clever." It was the first time anyone had said that. The words landed in his chest like a warm stone. When she left, the clanging of the steel seemed less lonely, the work less of a burden. She came back the next day, and the day after that, sometimes with food, sometimes just to sit with a book while he worked, her quiet presence a balm against the valley's silent judgment. The day he finished bolting the last steel panel into place, a cold autumn rain began to fall. Inside the Quonset, the sound was a deafening roar, a constant drumming that made conversation impossible. But it was dry. For the first time in months, Elias felt a profound sense of shelter. He and Barrow sat on an overturned bucket, the gray light filtering through the open front, and watched the rain turn the world outside into a soft, blurred watercolor. The next phase of the work was the most crucial, and the one that earned him the most ridicule. He rented a small bulldozer and began the painstaking process of backfilling, pushing the mountain of excavated earth back against the steel shell of the Quonset. He laid down layers of thick, waterproof membrane first, a black skin to keep the dampness out, then covered it with 2 feet of gravel for drainage, a French drain system at the base to channel water away. Then came the soil. "He's burying it," Mr. Abernathy was heard to proclaim at the general store. "The boy's gone and built himself a metal coffin, and now he's pulling the dirt in over the top. It's a tragedy is what it is." Elias ignored them. He worked with the precision his grandfather's journal demanded. The earth had to be compacted in layers, no more than a foot at a time, to prevent settling and ensure maximum insulation. It was slow, tedious work. The bulldozer was a clumsy beast, and he had to finish the fine work near the structure by hand, tamping the soil down until it was firm. He covered the entire structure, leaving only the front face and the 2 small openings for the ventilation pipes exposed. The final step was to cover the mounded earth with the original sod he had so carefully removed and set aside. By the time he was done, the Quonset hut had all but vanished. It was no longer a structure sitting on the land, but a feature of the land itself. A gentle, grass-covered swell in the hillside, indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain except for the flat, south-facing wall he had yet to build. His hands were a geography of his labor, a landscape of calluses, scars, and ingrained dirt that no amount of scrubbing could remove. His back was a constant, low-grade fire. But as he stood back and looked at the mound, a profound satisfaction settled over him. He had built the tortoise's shell. Now he had to make the inside livable. The south wall was his winter masterpiece. He framed it with heavy timbers salvaged from an old barn and installed 3 large, double-paned windows he'd bartered for with the last of his father's tools. They were expensive, an extravagance he couldn't really afford, but the journal was clear. The low winter sun was not an enemy to be blocked, but a free source of heat to be harvested. Passive solar gain, his grandfather had called it. He insulated the wall cavities with thick bats of wool from a neighbor's culled sheep, another trade for a winter's worth of firewood he chopped from his own woodlot. The farmhouse would be cold, but others would be warm because of his labor. The heart of the home was the rocket mass heater. It was another of his grandfather's designs, a super-efficient wood stove that burned small-diameter wood at extremely high temperatures. Instead of venting the hot exhaust straight up a chimney, the design funneled the gases through a long, winding flue of heavy pipe embedded in a massive thermal bench made of cob, a mixture of clay, sand, and straw. He spent a week building it, his hands caked in mud, shaping the bench that would serve as a couch, a warm place to sleep, and a massive heat sink. The theory was simple. The fire would burn hot and fast for an hour or two, heating the entire mass of the bench. The bench would then radiate a gentle, steady warmth back into the room for the next 24 hours. It was designed to use a fraction of the wood a conventional stove required. By the first week of November, it was done. The interior was Spartan: a bed, a small kitchen area with a hand pump for water drawn from a cistern, the cob bench, and a simple wooden table and chair. But it was a home. His home. The day he moved his few belongings from the cold, echoing farmhouse into the quiet, earthen-smelling space of the Quonset was one of the proudest of his life. He lit the first fire in the rocket mass heater. It roared to life with a satisfying whoosh, the sound of a contained dragon. Within an hour, the cob bench was warm to the touch. Barrow, who had been watching the process with a skeptical eye, circled the bench 3 times before curling up on it with a contented groan. Elias sat at his table, watching the late afternoon sun stream through the large windows, its light falling in golden rectangles on the floor. A thermometer he'd hung on the wall read 68 degrees. Outside, a bitter wind had begun to blow from the north, rattling the bare branches of the trees. It was the first breath of the coming winter. The valley was battening down its hatches, stacking cordwood high, sealing windows with plastic. Mr. Abernathy had stopped by again a week earlier, not to mock this time, but with a look of genuine concern. "The old-timers are saying it'll be a bad one, Elias," he'd said, his eyes scanning the nearly invisible dwelling. "Geese flew south a month early. Woolly caterpillars have thick coats. You be careful in this thing. Don't let pride be the death of you." "It'll work," Elias had said simply. Now, sitting in the quiet warmth, he felt a deep, unshakable certainty. He had followed the plans. He had trusted the earth. He had done the work. He laid his hand on his grandfather's journal. The house was built. The test was coming. The cold arrived not as a guest, but as an invading army. It came silently in the night, a week before Christmas. A high-pressure system that descended from the Arctic, a mass of air so dense and frigid it felt like a physical weight. The old-timers called it a Siberian Express. Temperatures, which had been hovering in the teens, fell off a cliff. By morning, it was 10 degrees below zero. The next day, it was 20 below. The wind came with it, a relentless, scouring force that found every crack and crevice in the valley's old farmhouses, leaching warmth with a ravenous hunger. In the valley, life ground to a halt. Schools closed. The engine block of Mr. Thorne's new Ford cracked clean in two. Water pipes in half the homes froze solid, then burst, creating glittering, destructive sculptures of ice inside kitchens and bathrooms. The demand for electricity surged as people plugged in space heaters, and the overloaded transformers on the power poles began to fail, their fuses blowing with a series of sharp pops that were quickly swallowed by the wind. One by one, sections of the valley went dark. For those who relied on wood and coal, the battle was constant. Stoves that normally kept a house comfortable now had to be fed around the clock, their metal sides glowing a dull, hungry red. The carefully stacked cords of firewood, meant to last until March, were disappearing at an alarming rate. Mr. Abernathy, his furnace supplemented by a large wood stove in the parlor, found he was burning through a week's worth of wood in a single day. The cold was a tangible beast, clawing at the windows, seeping through the walls. His thermometer, even in the warmest room of his well-built house, struggled to stay above 50 degrees. At night, they slept in layers of clothes and blankets, their breath pluming in the air. Inside the earth-sheltered Quonset, Elias Cole woke to a profound and unusual silence. The wind, which he could hear as a distant, high-pitched scream as it passed over the top of his dwelling, was not a threat. It was merely a sound, disconnected from his reality. There were no drafts, no rattling windows. The only noise inside was the gentle crackle from the rocket mass heater and the soft, rhythmic breathing of Barrow, asleep on the warm cob bench. He got up and walked barefoot on the cool but not cold concrete floor. The 3 large windows on the south face were covered in a delicate filigree of frost, but through them the world was a landscape of brutal, crystalline beauty. The sun, though low in the sky, was brilliant, its light reflecting off the snow-covered ground and pouring into the room. Elias felt the warmth on his face. He looked at the thermometer on the wall. It read 64 degrees. He had fired the stove for 2 hours the previous evening, using a small armload of dry pine and poplar branches, wood most people considered junk fuel. The heat had been absorbed by the massive cob bench, which now radiated a gentle, persistent warmth that filled the entire space. The earth surrounding him, a thick blanket of soil and rock, was doing its job, insulating him from the lethal air outside, its own stable temperature a massive buffer against the Arctic assault. He was living not against the winter, but within the earth, a passenger in its slow thermal journey. He made coffee, his movements unhurried. He had enough food for a month, enough water in the cistern. He had 157 books on a shelf he had built. He and Barrow were an island of temperate calm in an ocean of profound cold. The temperature outside continued to drop. By the 3rd day of the freeze, it reached 35 below zero, with wind chills approaching 70 below. It was a cold that killed. Exposed skin would freeze in minutes. It was a cold that broke things: metal, glass, the will of stubborn men. That afternoon, a figure appeared, struggling through the deep snowdrifts that had piled up against the windbreaks. It was Mr. Abernathy, his face obscured by a thick scarf and a fur-lined hat, only his eyes visible. He moved slowly, leaning heavily on a walking stick. Barrow, who had been dozing, got to his feet and let out a single, low woof. Elias opened the door. The cold that rushed in was a physical blow, a shocking, painful intrusion. Abernathy stumbled inside, bringing a swirl of snow and frigid air with him. He leaned against the doorframe, gasping, his breath coming in ragged white clouds. He unwrapped the scarf from his face. His cheeks were a waxy, dangerous white with frostbite. His eyes, red-rimmed and weary, darted around the space, taking in the scene. He saw Elias in a simple flannel shirt. He saw the dog, comfortable on the bench. He felt the air, not hot, not stuffy, but simply warm. A gentle, life-sustaining warmth. His gaze fell on the thermometer. He stared at it for a long moment, his expression one of utter disbelief. 64 degrees. "Our furnace gave out 2 days ago," Abernathy said, his voice a hoarse croak. "The wood stove, it can't keep up. The pipes are all burst. It's 40 degrees in our kitchen. My wife, Martha, she's not well. She can't take much more of this." He looked at Elias, the decades of pride and certainty stripped away, leaving only a raw, desperate vulnerability. He was not just a skeptic proven wrong. He was a man asking for help. "Elias, can my wife and I stay? Just until it breaks?" Elias looked at the old farmer, at the man who had called his home a grave. He saw no triumph in Abernathy's defeat, only need. He simply nodded. "Go get her," he said. "I'll put more coffee on." Abernathy returned half an hour later, helping his wife through the snow. Martha Gable was shivering uncontrollably, her face pale and drawn. Elias helped her to the cob bench, wrapping her in a thick wool blanket. She leaned against the warm surface, the heat slowly seeping into her chilled bones, and began to cry, silent tears tracking paths down her weathered cheeks. They were the first. By evening, others arrived. The Gables, whose propane tank was empty, the delivery truck unable to get through the snow-choked roads. Then the Thorns farmhand, a young man with a wife and a new baby, whose trailer was no match for the cold. He arrived with the baby bundled so thick it was just a round ball of blankets, its small face pinched and blue. Sarah appeared with her parents, their own home having lost power and heat. She met Elias's eyes as they came in, and her look was not of surprise, but of quiet affirmation. The Quonset became a refuge, an ark in a frozen world. 10, then 15, then 20 people filled the small space. They sat on the floor, on the bench, on overturned crates. They were a cross-section of the valley, the proud, the poor, the skeptical, the worried, and they were all witnesses. They watched as Elias fed the small firebox of the rocket stove with a handful of sticks. They touched the warm clay of the bench in wonder. They felt the steady, even temperature that did not waver. They saw the simple, elegant truth of his grandfather's design. Mr. Thorne arrived on the 4th day, his fine wool coat and expensive boots looking absurdly out of place. He did not ask for shelter. He still had a generator and a fireplace at his large estate. He came because he had to see it for himself. He stood in the doorway, his face a mask of stunned comprehension. He saw his farmhand's baby, now pink and sleeping peacefully in a makeshift cradle near the warm bench. He saw Abernathy, his frostbite tended to by Elias, talking in low tones with Mrs. Gable. He saw a community huddled together, not in misery, but in shared safety. He looked at the thermometer, then at the small pile of wood next to the stove. He looked at Elias. "I don't understand," Thorne said, his voice stripped of its usual authority. "The earth," Elias said, his answer simple and complete. The cold broke on the 5th day. The temperature climbed, agonizingly slowly, back toward 0. The wind died down. The immediate crisis was over. As people began to prepare to leave, to go back and assess the damage to their own homes, a quiet moment fell over the crowded room. It was Mr. Abernathy who broke the silence. He stood up, his joints stiff, and faced Elias. His face was solemn, his eyes clear. "I was wrong, son," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I was a fool. I laughed at you. I called this place a grave." He gestured around the room at the people who had found shelter there. "Turns out, it was the warmest place in the whole damn valley. You saved us. You and this house. I'm sorry." One by one, others echoed him. Mrs. Gable pressed a jar of preserves into his hands, her eyes wet with tears. Mr. Thorne, before he left, came to Elias and cleared his throat. "About that mortgage, Cole," he said, the words stiff with unaccustomed humility. "You come see me when the roads are clear. We'll work something out." He didn't apologize with words, but the offer was its own form of penance. When they had all gone, the Quonset was quiet again. Only Sarah remained, helping Elias tidy the space. The air was thick with the lingering smells of coffee, wet wool, and humanity. "You did it, Elias," she said softly, her hand finding his. He looked at their joined hands, then out the window at the slowly brightening world. The sun was melting the frost on the panes. The long test was over. His home had held. He had not just built a house, he had proven a principle. And in doing so, he had changed the valley forever. The winter of '58 became a legend in the valley, a new benchmark against which all other winters were measured. It was spoken of as the Great Freeze, the time the pipes burst and the power failed. But it was also remembered as the winter of Elias Cole's Hill House. The story of the boy who buried a metal shed and stayed warm through the worst of it became a piece of local folklore, told and retold until the facts took on the soft, worn sheen of a myth. But it was no myth to the people who had been there. The mockery Elias had endured curdled into a deep, abiding respect. He was no longer the strange, grieving orphan. He was the man who had listened to the earth when no one else would. In the spring, when the full extent of the winter's damage was clear, cracked foundations, ruined plumbing, lost livestock, people started coming to him not for shelter, but for advice. Mr. Abernathy was the first. He came not on his horse, but on foot, his hat in his hands. "Elias," he said, "my boy is looking to build on the North 40. I was wondering if you'd be willing to show him that book of your granddad's." Elias didn't hesitate. He invited him in and laid the worn journal on the table between them. For hours they went over the diagrams, Elias patiently explaining the principles of thermal mass, passive solar orientation, and superheated combustion. He wasn't a teacher, but he was a practitioner, and he spoke the simple language of materials and experience. He lent Abernathy's son the journal, and that summer another swell of green earth appeared on a hillside across the valley. It wasn't a Quonset. It was a small cottage built with timber and stone. But it was built into the hill, its largest windows facing south, its back protected by the embrace of the earth. Others followed. Elias never sought them out, but they came to him. He shared what he knew freely, expecting nothing in return. He helped one family design a greenhouse built into a slope, allowing them to grow vegetables nearly year-round. He showed another how to build a rocket stove to more efficiently heat their existing home. He became the valley's quiet consultant, its repository of unconventional wisdom. The ideas in his grandfather's journal, once the solitary obsession of an eccentric, began to take root in the community, sprouting up as new buildings, clever retrofits, and a changed way of thinking about the land. Elias and Sarah were married the following autumn, in a simple ceremony on the hill above the house. They moved her books and his tools in, and the Quonset, once a monument to solitary determination, became a home filled with quiet love and partnership. They raised 2 children there, a boy and a girl, who grew up thinking it was perfectly normal to have a roof you could picnic on. Through all the years, Barrow was a constant presence. He aged gracefully, his muzzle turning gray, his movements becoming slower, more deliberate. He was the keeper of Elias's history, the one who had been there from the very first shovelful of dirt. He'd lie on the warm cob bench, his old bones soothed by the gentle heat, and watch the life of the family unfold. He saw children take their first steps on the concrete floor. He greeted neighbors who came now not to scoff, but to share a cup of coffee. He was the silent, loyal heart of the home. One crisp fall morning, 20 years after the Great Freeze, Barrow did not get up from his spot by the fire. He was gone, having passed peacefully in his sleep in the warm, safe place he had guarded for so long. Elias carried his old friend's body, surprisingly light in his arms, up to the top of the hill. He buried him beneath a tall pine tree that looked out over the entire valley. He fashioned a simple grave marker from a flat piece of field stone. He didn't carve the dog's name into it. He didn't need to. He just needed to know where his friend was resting. He stood there for a long time, his hand on the rough stone, the wind whispering through the pine needles, a lonely sound that echoed the silence Barrow had left behind. The years continued to pass. Elias's children grew up and moved away, one to a city, the other to build an earth-sheltered home of her own on a distant coast, taking a hand-copied version of her great-grandfather's journal with her. Elias and Sarah grew old together in the house on the hill. His hair turned the color of winter frost, and his hands, though still strong, were gnarled with arthritis, a permanent record of a life of hard, meaningful work. He became a landmark himself, a quiet, stooped man who knew more about the valley's secrets, the way the water flowed underground, the spots where the sun hit just right in winter, than anyone alive. He never boasted. He never said, "I told you so." He didn't have to. His legacy was written into the landscape. It was in the half-dozen homes nestled into hillsides, in the greenhouses that extended the growing season, in the community that now faced its winters not with dread, but with a quiet, well-prepared confidence. When Sarah passed, Elias felt the loss like a physical blow, a hollowing out of the space he had so carefully built. He stayed on in the house, its silence now deeper, its memories more poignant. He found comfort in the familiar rhythms, in the stoking of the fire, in the way the winter sun still fell in golden bars across the floor. The house was his partner now, a living thing that cared for him as he had cared for it. Decades after he first broke ground, Elias Cole died, as peacefully as his old dog had, on a winter's night, warm in his bed. The thermometer on the wall read 64 degrees. He was 87 years old. The entire valley turned out for his funeral. They buried him on the hill, next to the unmarked stone of his faithful dog. Mr. Abernathy's grandson, a man Elias had taught how to build a cold frame, carved the epitaph into a large piece of granite they hauled up the slope. It was simple, just 5 words that captured the essence of his life. Elias Cole, he taught us to listen. Years later, a young family, new to the area, bought the old Cole property. They were skeptical of the strange, grass-covered lump in the hillside, this relic from another time. They considered bulldozing it and building a modern house on the site. But they spent one winter in it first, just to see. They marveled at how little firewood it took to stay warm, how quiet it was during a storm, how it felt less like a building and more like a sanctuary. One evening, the young father sat on the warm cob bench, a place still holding the faint memory of generations of warmth, and looked out the large south-facing windows at the snow-covered valley. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney, the only sign of the life held within. The structure stood, not as a monument of steel and concrete, but as a testament to a quiet, stubborn wisdom. It was a home. It had held. It would always hold.